Long, long ago in Scotland, there was a master baker named Lucy. For Lucy could make the best bannock cakes in the whole kingdom. Now, because her cakes were so good, everyone wanted one for their weddings, or their christenings, or their birthdays. And Lucy, she never said no. She would always make a cake for whoever needed it. Now, for those that had the money, she charged them a pretty fee for what they were getting. But for those who didn't have as much, well, they would come to her and ask her what it would cost, and she'd say, "Ah, tell me what you have, and that should be enough." And in the end, what usually happened was she would make the cake and bring it and wrap it as a gift for the family. That way they didn't have to pay, and she still was able to bring a wonderful cake to the family. Thing was, though, in Scotland, then and perhaps even now, there lived the little folk, the fairies, and they loved eating cake. They couldn't make it themselves, so they'd always sneak into places and steal a piece during the night. The problem was, with Lucy's cakes, they were always so good, there were never any pieces left over. And the king of the fairies began to plotting underneath his mound. He thought to himself, well, if we can't get some cake for ourselves, we'll bring the cake maker right here, and she can make cake for us, day after day after day. Well, the fairies right away got to work finding out where she was traveling. And when it so happened that she was cooking at a great feast in the castle, and coming back on a lonely road at dusk, the fairies knew they had their chance. As she came alongside a fairy mound, a big mound in the ground covered in grass, where people say the fairies live, fairies leaped from the grass and dribbled little bits of sleep dust on her eyes, making her feel so weary, as if the work hadn't done that already, that she thought, oh, I'll just stretch out here for a moment, and I'll get going again right after. And she lay down on what she thought was just a bit of grass beside the road, not knowing it was a true fairy mound. And once she was lying on a mound, she was in the fairies' power. When she woke up, she was inside the mound, and most people would be terrified by seeing fairies flit and fly here and there. But not this woman. For along with being the best baker in the whole land, she was also very clever. And she knew, if she was ever to escape the fairies, she must not let them know what she's thinking. She forced her mouth into a smile and said, "Ah! I've always been saying I'd love to see the land of the fairies, and here I am, right in it." And she looked around and smiled at all the fairies, and they thought she might be just a little angry at being kidnapped. But the king of the fairies flew up from his throne and said, "Baker woman, you make the best cakes in the whole kingdom. We want you to make cakes for us." The baker woman smiled. She guessed why she'd been kidnapped. So she said, "Okay. But I'll need some things, you see," she said, pulling out a clean apron from her bag and putting it on, tying it around her waist. And she began giving the fairies the list of things: flour and eggs, and her big mixing bowl, and a wire whisk. On and on the fairies flew off and came back, and flew off and came back, and flew off and came back, and Lucy's poor husband noticed things disappearing all over the house and wasn't sure what was happening. And as she began to mix the batter in the bowl, she stopped and said, "Well, it's just not working out right. I know what it is," she said. "My cat. I usually have my cat with me when I'm baking, and I can hear the purr of the cat, and that helps me stir in rhythm." "Get the cat," said the king, and a fairy flew off to get the cat. And after the cat had been set down at her feet, she began mixing again. She said, "Oh, you know, when my dog is snoring, I like that rhythm. It helps me go even faster." "Get the dog," said the king of the fairies. And soon the dog was there too. And our plan was now coming together. He said, you know, I've been working so hard here, I forgot all about my wee babe. My wee babe back at the house. I worry so much about him, it's hard to do work when I'm worried. Could you go get the babe? And the king of the fairies sent another fairy off to catch the babe. And when the baby got there, it was unhappy, for it would never let father feed it porridge in the morning, only mother. And it began to cry as soon as it saw her. And then she handed a little wooden spoon and began to bang the wooden spoon on the pots and the pans. Oh, you know, she said, if you went and got my husband, I bet you he could help out with the babe. And so the king of the fairies nodded, and another fairy flew off. And suddenly, poof, her husband was there. He'd been seeing things disappear in the house all the time and was worried it might be the fairies. But now that he saw his wife, his heart was at rest, for wherever she was, things would go well. And as she stirred the batter, she whispered over to her husband, "Pinch the cat." "What?" "Pinch the cat." And he pinched the cat, and the cat, meow. And then he stepped on the tail of the dog, woof, 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 woof. And so then the baby was banging away with its spoon, and the noise was so loud all the fairies flew around and covered their ears in the mound because it was so loud, and fairies hate things to be loud. And as the batter was done being stirred, Lucy reached down and took the spoon out of the hands of her baby and picked it up and cuddled it. And the little baby finally cooed and smiled and settled down. The dog and the cat settled down too, and they weren't being pinched or having their tails stepped on. "Well now," said Lucy, "now all we need is the oven." The king and the queen looked at each other. "Well, we don't have an oven." "Ah, I see. Well, how can you bake a cake without an oven?" "Well, you'll just have to carry me back to my house, and I'll put the pans in the oven, and you'll have to carry me back here when they're done." And the fairies, from flying all the way back and forth, were already exhausted. And the king of the fairies, he said, No, we're not going to do that, and we can't build an oven here. And we can't take this racket any longer. So, we can't carry you, or your husband, or your baby, or all these things, but we want you to be gone now. We can't take it, even if we were going to get some cake. And he clapped his hands, and the mountain split open. Well, the hill, really. And they could see sunlight again. And Lucy looked at the king of the fairies and said, "My lord, it's no fair that I'm always making cakes for others and never for you. So I'll bake these cakes, and I'll bring them back when they're done. And I'll put them behind the mound here for you and your people. In fact, I'll do it every week, if that's what you'd like." And the king smiled. "I'll not be outdone," he said, "for whatever you find at the back of the mound shall be yours, from now to the end of time." And true to her word, Lucy baked a wonderful cake for the fairies every week and set it behind the mound. And every week there was a leather purse full of gold coins there. And people say, with that money, the good she did, well, it can't even be measured. But that's a story for another day. And that's the end of this tale.